Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why sometimes it feels harder to talk to someone, especially if they're not looking right at you or if there is a lot of background noise? Well, this new study dives deep into how our eyes and heads move when we talk, and how that all changes when things get a bit tricky. This research explores how we use our eyes and heads to communicate, especially when listening is tough. Think about it. When your hearing isn't perfect or when there is a loud party happening, you probably rely more on what you can see. This study wanted to figure out exactly how that happens and if the way people sit affects our gaze. It's like trying to understand a secret language of head nods and eye movement. So the big question here is, how does the way we use visual cues, like looking at someone's face, change when hearing is difficult because of noise or because someone has a hearing impairment? And how does this show up in our gaze behavior, meaning where we look? These researchers brought people together for casual chats and tracked where they looked and how they moved their heads. They specifically looked at groups with one person who had a hearing impairment and two people with normal hearing. Then they played with two main things: the amount of background noise and where people sat in relation to each other. Imagine this setting a canteen at lunchtime. It can get pretty noisy, right? The researchers had small groups, each with one person who had a hearing impairment and two who didn't, sit at a table. They had them chat for a bit during quiet times and then again when it was noisy, like during actual lunch hours. They also changed how people were sitting. Sometimes everyone was across the table and other times one person was off to the side. To track what was going on, they used special eye-tracking glasses on one person in each conversation, either the person with the hearing impairment or one of the others. They also recorded their voices and where they were looking. They studied 12 different groups of 3 people. All the people in a group knew each other, which is pretty realistic for everyday conversations. The people with hearing impairments were regular hearing aid users, and they kept their hearing aids on during the experiment. They conversed in either English or Danish. The conversations happened in the real canteen. To create the noise conditions, they had one session during the busy lunch rush, meaning around 63 decibels of noise, and another session during a quieter time, about 48 decibels. So it wasn't super loud, but it was enough to represent a typical noisy environment. Each conversation piece lasted for 4 minutes. They used really cool eye-tracking glasses that record where someone is looking, along with a video of what they see. They also had microphones to record speech. The setup allowed them to see how gaze and head movements were linked to the actual conversation. After recording all the eye movements, they used fancy computer programs to figure out where exactly each person was looking. They could tell if someone was looking at one of their conversation partners, or maybe looking away. They could also track eye blinks, which can sometimes tell us about how much effort someone is putting into listening. They paid close attention to what happened right at the end of someone's turn talking, because that's often when people decide who's going to speak next. Now, all this data needed to be crunched. They used special computer models called mixed effects models to see how things like noise, having a hearing impairment, and where people sat actually affected things like blink duration, how long someone looked at another person, and how often they moved their eyes. They were essentially trying to find patterns and see if the differences they observed were just random chance or actual. Meaningful effects. A p-value, for example, is like a flukometer. The lower it is, the less likely the result is just a random chance. Let's get to what they found. It is pretty interesting stuff. First off, blinks. When people were sitting with someone to their side, they tended to blink a bit more and for a bit longer. This might suggest they were focusing more intensely or perhaps experiencing a bit more effort. During listening, when both people were sitting across from each other, eye fixations, meaning how long people looked at one spot, were longer. But when it was noisy, people moved their eyes more often, especially when they were talking. Sitting to the side also increased eye movements, both when listening and talking. This suggests that when things are noisy or when someone is to the side, people are constantly scanning their surroundings more. This is where it gets really telling. When people were listening, they spent less time looking at the face of someone seated next to them. They much preferred looking at people sitting directly in front. And guess what? The amount of time spent looking at the talker's face actually increased when the environment was noisy. This was especially true for people with hearing impairments. They looked more at the talker in noise compared to quiet, while it didn't make a big difference for people with normal hearing. This tells us that when hearing is harder, we lean more on what we see. When people were listening, their head and gaze weren't always perfectly aligned. If someone was sitting next to them at a 90-degree angle, people didn't turn their heads as directly towards that person. They were less directly faced. This was particularly noticeable for people with hearing impairments at a 20-degree position. During talking, their head and gaze varied even more when someone was seated to the side. suggesting more dynamic head movement and scanning. This part is crucial for understanding conversation flow. They looked at who people were gazing at right when someone stopped talking. When people were getting ready to talk next, they were much more likely to be looking at the person who was currently speaking. This makes sense. You are paying attention to grab the next turn. Noise also made it more likely for people to look at the talker at the end of a listening turn. But this effect was complicated by who was where. And when someone was talking, their gaze at the end of their turn was a good predictor of who would speak next. They were more likely to look at the person who would take the next turn. However, if one of the listeners was seated next to the talker with a hearing impairment was less likely to look at that person at the end of their speaking turn. This suggests that even when speaking, hearing impairment can influence who you connect with visually. Interestingly, how engaged people felt didn't change much based on noise or seating. But they did report feeling more listening effort in noisy conditions, and people with hearing impairments reported even more effort when it was noisy. This lines up with our intuition that challenging listening situations are just tougher. So, what does it all mean? The study confirms that how people sit has a big impact on where we look. People sitting at a 90-degree angle were looked at less, and this led to more eye movements like more saccades, which are quick eye movements, and shorter fixations. This suggests people were constantly trying to scan and catch up on visual information from the person on the side. Noise did increase looking at other people, especially for those with hearing impairments. This supports the idea that when hearing is harder, we use our eyes more to help us understand what is going on. They also saw that during talking, in noisy conditions, people were more dynamic in their visual scanning. They were looking around more perhaps to pick up on subtle cues from others, but maybe keeping their gaze more stable when they were focusing on one person. Hearing impairment itself had a smaller effect, partly because everyone was wearing their hearing aids. However, when people had a hearing impairment, they sometimes turned their heads slightly less directly towards someone at a 20-degree angle. And when they were talking, they spent a bit less time looking at their listeners than people with normal hearing. This might mean that people with hearing impairments are trying to conserve effort by moving their heads less, or perhaps relying more on their other senses. The seating position was the biggest game changer. Being seated to the side really changed how people looked and moved. It seems like our brains naturally prefer to focus on people directly in front of us for smooth conversation. When someone is on the side, it requires more effort to keep up with them visually. Now, like all research, this study has its limits. They could only track one person's eyes at a time, so they couldn't see how two people looked at each other or how their gazes interacted. Also, conversations happened in either English or Danish, and language can affect how we talk and interact. They also didn't look at how much hearing loss someone had, just that they had some, and that everyone was wearing their own hearing aids, which can vary a lot. Overall, this study highlights a few key things. First, where people sit really matters in conversations. If you want someone to look at you more, sitting in front of them is a good bet. Second, while noise and hearing impairment do affect how we use our eyes and heads, the effects are often more subtle than we might expect, especially when people are using their hearing aids. And importantly, the study found that the way people look is a pretty good signal for predicting who will talk next, even in noisy and complicated situations. This is super important for developing future technologies, like smarter hearing aids that could use eye gaze to better understand who to focus on. Imagine a hearing aid that could automatically direct its microphones to the person you are looking at. This research shows that gaze is a valuable cue, but it also points out that systems relying on gaze alone might get confused if someone is off to the side. My take on this is that it's a fantastic look at how our nonverbal communication really works in everyday, messy situations. It shows how adaptable we are, using our eyes and heads to make up for hearing challenges. The fact that seating position has such a strong effect is a practical takeaway for anyone looking to improve communication, whether it is suggesting how friends might sit at a dinner party or designing better meeting rooms. This research really emphasizes that our communication is a whole-body experience, not just about what we hear. It also opens the door for more research into how these gaze patterns interact with different hearing aid settings, or how people with other communication challenges might use their gaze. So, what do you think about these findings? Have you ever noticed yourself or others changing their gaze behavior in noisy environments? Or when someone is seated to the side? Let me know in the comments below. If you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science explained simply, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into the fascinating world of psychology and human behavior. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.